Okay, welcome to today's lecture, and this is our last lecture for AP World History. This is Unit 9, Globalization, 1900 to the present. So I'm going to start with 9.1, Advances in Technology and Exchange. What you want to talk about with technology is that there are new modes of communication. For example, radio, cellular, and internet. When you answer questions on the AP exam, make sure you start with the general, new modes of communication, and then go to the specific, such as radio, cellular, and internet. Okay, important tip there. And also there are new transportation technologies. For example, airplanes, using airplanes to transport items. And then you also have shipping containers, which is another feature in transportation. Make sure you can also talk about energy technologies, and specifically petroleum and nuclear power. So pictured on the top would be petroleum, and pictured on the bottom would be nuclear power. What we see is there is an increase in productivity and an increase which increased the production of material goods. Petroleum is used for many things, not only for to be refined for oil for vehicles, but it is also used as byproducts in food, for example. And it's also used for lubricant in factories. Nuclear power, as pictured below, the use of nuclear power varies by country and also within countries, so it's not evenly used. So there are some countries that use a lot of nuclear power, and some countries that don't use any nuclear power. Crude oil, that is a raw natural resource. And petroleum, the definition is a liquid mixture of hydrocarbons that is present in certain rock strata and can be extracted and refined to produce fuels, including gasoline, kerosene, and diesel oil. So pictured on the top left, you will often see petroleum engineers out, in the field checking the refineries, the tanks, the processing. So extracting the oil is a primary activity. Primary activity is when you get something from the earth, for example, like oil. When it is refined, we call that a secondary activity. You can also say secondary sector of the economy. On the right, you can see the temperature as it increases. You can see changes to what type of fuel it is and how they're able to refine it, where it can be used as gas or as a chemical or car gas or jet fuel or diesel fuel, or like I mentioned earlier, different types of like lubrication, also fuel for ships and for factories and central heating, and also used in things like roads and roofing. Nuclear power comes from nuclear fission, and nuclear power reactors use heat produced during atomic fission to boil water and produce pressurized steam. So we're talking about very, very hot water. Steam is routed through the reactor steam system to spin large turbines, blades that drive magnetic generators to produce electricity. And so this image here is from Encyclopedia Britannica, and you can see on the left is the nuclear reactor, where it has the core and the control rods. You have a water pump. You can see the flow of water, which is the red piping, and then you can see the arrows showing you which direction it's going, producing steam, which is turning that turbine, and powering the electric generator that is then sent across transmission lines. You also have a warm condenser water, and that's going to capture some of that warm moisture, and it can be cooled down into a cooling tower, and then eventually it's going to be dumped back into a lake or a river. Sometimes if it's not done properly, the water is still too hot, and massive changes in temperature in water will kill aquatic life. All right. Another advancement in technology includes birth control. Birth control gave women greater control over fertility. This transformed reproductive practices and contributed to declining rates of fertility, because the more women are empowered to control their bodies, the less children they are likely to have. And so you're going to see falling birth rates with the increased use of birth control. So the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, approved the first oral contraceptive in 1960, and it is known commonly as the pill. It's a daily pill that contains hormones to change the way the body works and prevent pregnancy. There are other types of contraceptives such as surgical and implants, and all of these, even the ones pictured on the right, are just other examples of technology. The Green Revolution and commercial agriculture. So the Green Revolution is a large increase in crop production in developing countries, and this is achieved by using fertilizers, pesticides, and high-yield crop varieties. So on the bottom left are farmers in India. As you could see, that this is taking a lot of manual labor. On the bottom right is commercial agriculture. This is an increase in productivity, and this has led to farmers being able to sustain the Earth's growing population. So as the population increases, demographic change, what you're going to find is an increased demand for food. And so the Green Revolution was the answer to the rising population. And it was meant originally to help people in the least developed countries, but instead largely helped big farmers, corporate farmers in the developed part of the world, leading to commercial agriculture. So that's the Green Revolution was more of the 1950s, 1970s. GMOs were discovered in the 1970s and went into widespread use by the 1990s. And so GMO is not the same thing as the Green Revolution, so please don't write that on your exam. GMO stands for genetically modified organisms, and it refers to a living plant, animal, or microorganism that's been subjected to biotechnology. And if you look at the image on the top right, you can see that a GMO is where a scientist has modified the DNA. And because of this, what we see are larger fruits and vegetables. Maybe they're stronger. They might be, more red. They might be able to last longer, and so on. And so there is a spread of chemical and genetically modified form of agriculture. Some medical innovations you should know include the vaccines and antibiotics. On the timeline there shows you in the 18th century, right at the turn, you have the invention of the smallpox vaccine. And then almost 100 years later, you have rabies vaccine and typhoid vaccine. About 20 years later, right after World War I, you have the tuberculosis vaccine. And then during World War II, you have the influenza vaccine. By 1953, polio vaccine. Polio was an epidemic that often led to people having physical disabilities. You also have hepatitis B vaccine in 1969. In 1971, you have the big one, which is the MMR, which is measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And so what we see is that there are changes in the medical field that has increased the ability of humans to survive and live longer. The way vaccines work, there's a couple different types of vaccines, but basically they contain a weakened form of the virus or the bacteria. There are even vaccines now that use RNA instead of having a dead virus or a weakened virus. On the bottom right is penicillin. It is one group of antibiotics used to treat bacterial infections. So 9.2 is technological advances and limitations after 1900, for example, disease. So diseases in medical and developments, what we have seen is that some are associated with poverty and have persisted because of this. So there are new epidemics that have threatened the human population and even caused social disruption. So these outbreaks led to technological and medical advances, but some diseases are occurring at a higher rate of incidence because of longevity. So what are the diseases associated with poverty? This includes cholera, malaria, and tuberculosis. So cholera is water and foodborne. That's how it's transmitted. And where the pathogen is able to take place is the wall of the small intestine, and so it's ingested. And signs and symptoms include severe diarrhea, dehydration, and because when somebody has the diarrhea, they are going to lose a lot of nutrients, and therefore they'll become dehydrated through the loss of water and salts. Malaria, it is transmitted by an insect vector, so usually a female mosquito, but it can also be passed through blood transfusions and unsterile needles. And the site of the pathogen is going to be in the liver, red blood cells, or even the brain. And signs and symptoms include fever, shivering, sweating, an enlarged spleen, headaches, anemia, muscle pain. And then tuberculosis, the method of transmission is usually through airborne droplets, so like somebody coughing or sneezing. Can also be through eating or drinking contaminated or unpasteurized dairy products. And so usually the initial infection is in the lungs, and then secondary infections can be in the lymph nodes, bones, and the intestines. And symptoms include persistent cough, coughing blood, chest pain, fever, sweating, weight loss, and diarrhea. Cholera spreads through water, like I mentioned. It's pictured on the top right. You can see that this is probably an LDC and a least developed country, and you can see that they have unsanitary conditions. One of the culprits for malaria is standing water. Standing water breeds mosquitoes. So tuberculosis spreads through the air, as I mentioned, and on the chart on the bottom right, you can see a graph showing you from the poorest country to the richest country, the rate of incidence of tuberculosis, and so it is highly associated with poverty. So malaria, not Maria, it says Maria here. Malaria spreads through infected mosquitoes. So first there's a bite from an infected mosquito that transmits malaria. Then the parasite travels to your liver where they lie dormant about 10 days to 4 weeks. The parasite then leaves the liver and infects red blood cells. This is where malaria signs and symptoms typically develop. So prior to that, people are asymptomatic as it's dormant. And then finally, malaria is transmitted to an uninfected mosquito when it bites someone with a disease. That mosquito can then spread malaria to other humans. So even though malaria is preventable and curable, it remains one of the world's deadliest diseases, and children under 5, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are most vulnerable. So pictured here on the map, on the top is the estimate of world malaria burden, where you're going to find a lot of cases of malaria, and on the bottom is to show you the correlation of data in how it's associated with poverty, high rates of poverty. So there are emergent epidemic diseases. For example, in 1918, you have the influenza pandemic, which was known colloquially, as the Spanish flu. And kind of like, it wasn't from Spain though, that's just kind of how it was called. And there's over 500 million infected, 25 million or more people are killed, which is more than what was killed during the war. You also have Ebola, and you also have HIV and AIDS. So you might ask yourself, what's an epidemic? What's a pandemic? So an epidemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. A pandemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease over a whole country or the whole world at a particular time. So, for example, COVID, we refer to it as a pandemic. The Ebola virus disease emerged in 1976 in present-day South Sudan and in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It is rare, but it is usually fatal. So if you look at the map there, you can see that the high incidence of Ebola is in and around Central Africa towards Western Africa. All of it is sub-Saharan Africa, below the Sahara Desert. You can see on the right that people are really close to infected bodies as they, try their best to wear hazmat suits. But you do have other people who are near the bodies as well. HIV and AIDS. So HIV stands for the human immunodeficiency virus. It's a virus that attacks the body's immune system. If HIV is not treated, it can lead to AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, there's a lot of medicine today. It does not cure HIV, but it does stall it from turning into AIDS. So HIV infection in humans came from a type of chimpanzee in Central Africa, and studies show that HIV might have jumped from chimpanzees to humans as far back as the late 1800s. The chimpanzee version of the virus is called simian immunodeficiency virus, and it was probably passed to humans when humans hunted these chimpanzees for meat and came into contact with their infected blood. If you look at the map, this is showing HIV prevalence in 2022, and this is looking at the population between 15 and 49, which is considered the reproductive ages. You can see that HIV is the highest incidence in Southern Africa as well as Eastern Africa. Which diseases are associated with increased longevity, like how long you're living? That includes heart disease and Alzheimer's. So the longer people live, we're seeing higher risk of these two diseases. So you might ask yourself, what's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? It's often people use it as synonyms, but it's not quite the same. So Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So let's start with what is dementia. Dementia is a general term, and it's for symptoms like decline in memory, decline in reasoning, or other thinking skills. So dementia is more the general. Alzheimer's is a specific brain disease that accounts for 60 to 80% of dementia cases. And so Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. Alzheimer's is a cause of dementia. What are the types of heart disease? So one of the ones you hear a lot is arrhythmias, cardiac arrhythmias, and that's like irregular heartbeats, for example. You also have heart infections, heart failure, heart valve disease. So oftentimes people, they might have a heart attack. They might not die from the heart attack. They might be able to get either a bypass surgery for the heart, or they can also, if they're not able to get the bypass surgery they need, they might be able to get a stent in their heart, which will help open up the valves. All right, 9.3, we're moving into technological advances, talking about the environment. So what are some environmental changes? Well, what we're seeing is a lot of human activity, deforestation, desertification, air pollution, water pollution, and competition over resources are the changes from the human activities. So for example, think about industries and how factories pollute the air by burning fuel and releasing CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, into the air. You also have water pollution. For example, the aluminum industry uses a lot of water to separate aluminum from bauxite ores, and because of that, they are a heavy polluter of water. Soil, because of like where you build the factory, or like I said, drainage, as well as forests, cutting down forests in order to build factories. And the same can be said for mining and agriculture and other kinds of drainage issues. With agriculture, one of the things to point out is how pesticides, which is another technology, how pesticides run off and they end up in the water system and drainage system, which can contaminate human drinking water, is another issue. There are environmental movements, so let's talk about Greenpeace. In the center picture, you can see Greenpeace is protesting, and they're on a boat, and it says "Stop Deep Sea Mining." On the top right, you could see that they are saying no climate justice without gender justice. And on the bottom, it says "and the plastic era." So, biodiversity of forest and oceans. Greenpeace wants people to preserve, protect, and restore the Earth's forests and oceans. In climate and energy, Greenpeace challenges the power of fossil fuel corporations and advocate for renewable energy, push for citizen-powered energy, and hold big polluters accountable. And for social and economic, they want to end collusion. That means like making deals, shady deals, between governments and corporations. All right, the Green Belt movement. So this was started by Professor Wangari Maathai in Kenya. The goal was to have the community take action and take some steps to address Kenya's deforestation. And this was led by a woman, and a lot of women came together into these civic action groups, and one by one they planted trees and worked to grow the forest. There's a video link there for those of you who I have for class, and you're able to access that video. 9.5, call for reform and responses after 1900. So, there are challenges to assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. For example, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights sought to protect the rights of children, women, and refugees, and they still do. And global feminism movements. There's also the negritude movement, And this is where they used art to address internalized racism and African and Afro diasporic subjugation and colonization. On the top right, there's an image there of an artist who is using art as the medium to address issues of racism and colonization. And then you have the liberation theology in Latin America. So the clergy and the oppressed classes, the lower classes of Latin America, united together, and they reinterpreted the role of the Catholic Church in everyday society, and they reclaimed religion toward the pursuit of social justice. So in other words, taking religion away from, the use of the incorrect use of religion, and instead making it more accessible and as an avenue to those in the lower class. On the right is an image of a mural that somebody painted as part of this movement. There is an increased access to education and political and professional roles. For example, looking at the right to vote. So in the United States, women were able to vote in 1920. In Brazil, it was 1932 for women. In Turkey, 1934. Japan, 1945. India, 1947. Morocco, 1963. And those are just a few examples. There's a rising rate of female literacy around the world. There's a rising rate of women in higher education. In the United States, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 greatly expanded voting rights. You also have in South Africa the end of apartheid, which was the legal separation of the races. And you have caste reservation that ends in India, where the caste system becomes illegal. Now, even though all of these things were passed or were ended, or women had more access, it's still not equal in most cases. On the bottom left, you can see M.L. King, Martin Luther King Jr., who used church sermons and nonviolence to unite people towards an increase in civil rights. In the center, you can see this is people are saying, they want their voting rights now. On the bottom right, President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who's from Texas, by the way, he said, "It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." Here is LBJ signing the voting rights into law. All right, caste reservation. Let's talk about this. So in India, for thousands of years, status was tied to birth. So what the family you were born into, right, it was considered based on your past actions. So if you were born into like a family of a higher caste, which means they have more status and probably more wealth, then you had good actions. You were a good person in your previous life. And if you're born into the lower caste, then you must have did something that, your actions were bad, and that's how you got there. So there was high caste and low caste, and the high caste had the following reserved for themselves: spiritual leadership, wealth, political power, education, ownership of land, and trade. When the British colonization ended and the Indian Constitution started, it included the caste system, reservations for scheduled tribes and caste. Later, it was amended to include other backwards communities, OBC, and in 2019, they expanded to include economically weaker sections. So although caste is illegal, it is still used by the government to label and help people who have historically been prevented from accessing certain jobs and services. So the purpose is to provide opportunities for the underprivileged communities, but it is also controversial as well. And so on the right, top right, you can see people at a protest, and it says, reserved nation, divided nation, our fate in hands of reservation. And then there's a chart there for you that you could look at, government jobs, and how they have it for open competition, and you can see that they have a certain percentage set aside for scheduled tribes or caste and the other backwards communities and the economically weaker sections. 9.6, globalized culture after 1900. So there are political and social changes. This led to changes in the arts. Art is the expression of ideas and emotions through a physical medium like painting, sculpture, film, dance, writing, photography, or theater. And after 1950, popular culture and consumer culture became more global. Arts, entertainment, and popular culture now reflected the influence of a globalized society, and consumer culture, focusing on consumerism and buying a lot of goods, that it became globalized and transcended national borders. You have music, for example, such as reggae. It is a popular music of Jamaican origin that combines native styles with elements of rock and soul music, and is performed at moderate tempos with the accent on the offbeat. If I have you for class, there's a link there if you want to look at the history of reggae. Movies, for example, Bollywood, which is a play on the word Hollywood. This is the movie industry out of Bombay, which is known as Mumbai now. And one of the movies that I like is called Gunday, and there's a picture of it there. And so there's a really good music video I like from that movie. And so a lot of the Bollywood movies have a lot of music, a lot of dancing. All right, social media. For example, Facebook. Again, remember, be general and then be specific. So you want to say new forms of globalized culture, access through the internet, for example, social media like Facebook. So there was even a movie made about Facebook called The Social Network. And here's a little quick history of social media pictured here on the visual. So first you have Facebook, and then after Facebook you have YouTube. And so we're talking about like 2004, 2005. Then you have Twitter. And finally, there's about 100 million YouTube videos watched per day. You have Tumblr, you have Pinterest, and then Facebook starts to use the like button. And then Instagram launches an iOS app, and it reaches 1 million users in its first year. Tumblr reaches 1 billion posts. Pinterest becomes the fastest site to reach 10 million users. Then you have Google Plus, you have Yahoo, and so on. And so, even talking about things like TikTok, that's going to count for points on the AP exam. For television, you have, for example, the British Broadcasting Company known as BBC, and it was formed in 1922 by a group of leading wireless manufacturers, including Marconi, who invented the radio. So 1920 is where it all began, turning early radio experiments into a new medium called broadcasting. globalized culture, sports. So the World Cup, or FIFA, um, you have it started in 1930. FIFA is an acronym. They're the ones who are in charge of the World Cup, and there are tournaments with 32 teams. In 2018, there were nearly 4 billion viewers of the World Cup. In 2022, it was held in Qatar. I remember one of the big headlines out of that one was when they announced that they would not be selling beer. The other one is that women could not attend all events, and um, there were certain days or times where the women could go. In 2022, the winner of the World Cup was Argentina. 2026 World Cup will be held in cities across 3 countries, US, Mexico, and Canada. And in 2026, the Cup will expand to 48 teams. Um, and you have people who gain a lot of media exposure and become international sports stars, such as Lionel Messi. The Olympics started in 1896, and it's based on the Greeks' ancient Olympic Games, and the modern Olympic Games are considered the world's foremost sports competition. So, like, that's the ultimate goal of athletes. More than 200 teams representing sovereign states and territories participate. It's held every 4 years since 1994, and they've been alternated between the Summer and Winter Olympics every 2 years during the 4-year period. And the growth has created numerous challenges and controversies. For example, boycotts, doping, bribery, and terrorism, to name a few. In 9.6, you also want to talk about global commerce. These are some big names you might have heard of, like Alibaba and eBay. So eBay was founded in 1995. It was a company, e-commerce company out of San Jose, California, and it connects buyers to sellers and retail sales through online marketplaces in 190 markets worldwide. Of course, now there's all kinds of e-commerce companies, and eBay no longer monopolizes the market. You have Amazon, and then you have, like, even, for example, like TikTok Shop, for example, Temu, Alibaba Express. So Alibaba was founded in 1999. It's a Chinese multinational technology company specializing in e-commerce, retail, internet, and technology. And Alibaba.com was expected to improve the domestic e-commerce market, perfect an e-commerce platform for Chinese enterprises, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, and to help China export its products to the global market, as well as to address World Trade Organization challenges. Pictured here is Jack Ma. Jack Ma is known for being controversial and outspoken, and sometimes he puts his foot in his own mouth, and the government, scorns him. They get after him, and then he falls back in line, and that just shows the authoritarian characteristic of the Chinese state. So, talking about global brands, let's start by looking at Coca-Cola, an American multinational corporation founded in 1892. The original recipe in 1886 by a pharmacist, first advertised as a healthy tonic to help with headaches. So kind of think of like a natural remedy. In 1889, formula and brand were sold for $2,300, roughly 70. That's equivalent to 71,000 in 2022. And finally, the Coca-Cola company was incorporated in Atlanta in 1892, and they largely produce syrup concentrate, and then the concentrate is sold to bottlers. Think of like factories that specialize in that throughout the world. The company owns its anchor bottler in North America, Coca-Cola Refreshments. Looking at vehicles, for example, Toyota Motor Corporation, founded in 1937, is a Japanese multinational um, automotive manufacturer. Toyota Industries developed a Type A engine in 1934, and both companies are now part of the Toyota Group, which is one of the largest conglomerates in the world. So, like many businesses under one. Toyota is the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, producing about 10 million vehicles per year. One thing that I can tell you about Toyota is they are known for keeping their value. So even after having it for years and having many miles, Toyotas do really well on keeping the value up. So there's resistance to globalization. So people are responding to rising cultural and economic globalization. So there's a lot of protests against the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and that's supposed to say anti. I did not spell that right. As well as protests against the World Bank. People believe that the IMF and the US are intertwined, so they kind of see it as like, backroom deals. Protesters see IMF deals as colonization agreements. One of the things the IMF does is it urges economic liberalization policies, so that's like opening up to free market, and as well as austerity measures, which include things like having tax cuts, for example. In 2022, Argentina owed the IMF $18 billion, for example. Activists have challenged the imposition of foreign debt and its constraints on national autonomy and democracy. In other words, like a country is weakened when it owes a foreign organization money, is what they're saying. The demands included lower prices and restored government subsidies, wage increases that will compensate for higher prices or jobs, and protesters have demanded that the World Bank stop funding social and environmental destructive projects, specifically oil, mining, and gas. All right, another thing we can talk about is locally developed social media. And so, in resistance to globalization, you have local social media platforms such as Weibo that was launched in China in 2009. From 2017 to 2020, the platform was international, but this ended because of the U.S. relation with China. And this is a similar platform to Twitter, which of course now is called X. So one of the things to talk about with Weibo in China is censorship. And so they're looking at keywords, games, animes, and shorts. Critical information is censored, for example, like COVID in China, because, of the whole epicenter of it in Wuhan, the Wuhan province and all that. And suspension of trending topics. I remember when the TikTok ban went on for, what was it, like 9 hours or something, and a lot of people joined Red Note. And one of the things that Red Note uses a lot of are cat memes, because the Chinese government's going to let you look at cat memes. Those are fine, right? So just make sure you understand how a government can use social media as a way to control the narrative or the news, or whatever social things people are looking at. So there are some enforcements. For example, in 2014, users must use their real name. And in China, they have a lot of moderators that read content. All right, 9.8, institutions developing in a globalized world. So new international organizations, including the United Nations, formed with the stated goal of maintaining world peace and facilitating international cooperation. So this was at the end of World War II. The UN is a diplomatic and political international organization whose stated purposes are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, and achieve international cooperation and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. Pictured there is at the UN, and you can see how it's set up kind of to look like a Congress, for example. There are some countries who believe that the UN is too powerful, or they overstep their their power, which infringes on a country's sovereignty. So you might be surprised that even countries like North Korea have a seat at the UN. There are two specific territories or areas that don't have a seat, and that is Palestine and you also have the Holy See, which is Vatican City. And so they are what we call permanent observers, and so they're able to like go to the meetings and hear everything and get copies, but they cannot like vote and things like that. All right, and so that's the end of today's lecture and our last lecture of the school year.